What is Radley Balko's perspective on the critical importance of civil liberties? Join Richard Ebeling and me and Radley Balko in this week's Libertarian Angle, which is focused on the critical importance of civil liberties as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to this special episode of Libertarian Angle, which is part of our online series for 6 weeks devoted to the critical importance of civil liberties. We have a very special guest, Radley Balko, a good friend. There are few, if any, more stalwart libertarian defenders of civil liberties than Radley Balko. It's just a real honor that Radley would join us. He is a former opinion editor, opinion writer for the Washington Post, where he was for many years. He's got one of the best blogs, if not the best blogs, on the drug war and civil liberties called The Watch. I highly recommend you subscribe. You subscribe to it, that you pay for the subscription. Well worth it. Radley has written for major publications: Wall Street Journal, Forbes, Playboy, Los Angeles Times, Reason, many others. He's appeared on major shows: CNN, Fox News, CNBC. Written several books. The greatest, in my opinion, is called The Rise of the Warrior Cop. His blog there at Substack, called The Watch, is devoted to the drug war, civil liberties, criminal justice. You won't find better stuff in those three areas than at The Watch at Substack. He's written a lot about no-knock raids. His stuff on no-knock raids was actually profiled in the New York Times and then later mentioned or cited in a dissent by Justice Breyer in the U.S. Supreme Court case of Hudson versus Michigan. Radley, thank you very much for taking the time to join us and share your perspectives with us. Take it away.
Well, thanks, Jacob. That was a very generous introduction. So when Jacob reached out and asked me to give this talk and said I could make it about anything I wanted, decided it should probably be pretty current and we should address what's happening right now. So I want to talk about how over the last 7, 8, 9 months of Trump administration 2.0, we've seen sort of pillars of what we consider kind of the epitome of a free society come tumbling down in pretty astonishing, with pretty astonishing speed. Jacob mentioned my book, Rise of the Warrior Cop, which was published in 2013, so about 12 years ago. About 4 months ago, I attended a conference in Washington on the future of democracy in America. I was hosted by Shikha Dalmia, who's used to be my colleague at Reason Magazine and her organization. And what was interesting about it is I used to live in DC. I moved to Nashville, Tennessee about 15 years ago. And the day before this conference was the day that Trump called up National Guard troops in DC. So there were literally National Guard troops outside of this conference. And, there were a lot of people at that conference that have known for a really long time. And a lot of them asked me, how it feels to have been right about all of this, citing my book that came out in 2013. And, for one, I don't want to be right about such a terrible thing, but actually I wasn't right, because what Rise of the Warrior Cop was about the militarization of police forces. It was about this idea that we were letting our law enforcement agencies become more and more kind of soldier-like, warlike, both in the equipment they used, in the culture, in the tactics that they used. What the book kind of took as a given was this long tradition that we've had in the United States of keeping the military out of domestic law enforcement. And I'm going to get into kind of the history here in a minute, but that has never really been a problem here. I mean, there have been times when the military has been called up to deal with, some rioting, sometimes with labor disputes. Probably the most notable time the military was called up to do kind of routine day-to-day policing was during Reconstruction after the Civil War. And people can debate whether those various call-ups were or weren't appropriate, but they were done with a lot of appreciation for the heaviness and profundity of that decision, right? That this isn't something free societies routinely do. Um, and once, with the exception of Reconstruction, which of course lasted for about a decade, every other incident where the military was called up to do domestic policing was short-lived. As soon as the crisis abated, the troops kind of returned to their regular jobs and left the area that they were called up to. Um, so I want to talk about, let's see, one, two, three, four, five. I've got six if I have time. Kind of pillars of a free society that I think we have seen this administration show very little reverence or respect for it, and basically tried to obliterate. Um, so the first one I want to talk about is this idea of using the military for routine everyday policing. This is something the founders feared. They looked at what happened in Rome when the Praetorian Guard started, the Roman military started becoming a force for domestic politics, and the disastrous results of that. Um, they looked at what happened in the streets of Boston in the years leading up to the American Revolution. Um, the British monarchy had stationed British troops in the streets of American cities for the sole purpose of enforcing tariffs and enforcing import taxes on various goods, and also keeping goods out that had been prohibited. And this became a source of rage for the colonists in these cities, and particularly in Boston. These troops were armed with what they called general warrants, which basically gave them the authority to enter anyone's home at any time to search for contraband. People like John Hancock were targeted by these troops and became radicals because of it. And it basically spurred on the American Revolution. It was the anger over having these troops in the streets, over being treated sort of like an occupied territory, um, that caused the citizens of Boston to rise up against the British troops and to basically go after them during just before the Boston Massacre. The British troops then opened fire and killed several of the citizens of Boston, and that was one of those precipitating incidents that inspired the American Revolution. I think you could argue that anger over British troops in the streets of Boston is why we have a Second Amendment, a Third Amendment, and the Fourth Amendment. If you go back and look at the debate during the Constitutional Convention, it's right there, right? It was this idea that uh, the military is not an appropriate tool for domestic policing. The military's job is to annihilate a foreign army, and that they lacked kind of the nuance and the appreciation of basic rights to enforce the law against their fellow citizens. Um, so as I said, I think, for the most part, we've done a pretty good job in the US of keeping the military out of domestic policing. I mentioned several notable exceptions, but again, these were mostly, with the exception of Reconstruction, these were all temporary. When the president did call them up, when Eisenhower, for example, called up the 82nd Airborne to integrate the schools in Little Rock, it was done only as a last resort. It was done after the governor of Arkansas had mobilized the state National Guard to keep black students out of the white schools. And again, as soon as Eisenhower was satisfied that the state was going to start complying with federal law, the troops were withdrawn. What Trump is doing is basically sort of thumbing his nose at this history. Let me give one more example, actually, because I think it's a good one. In the 1980s, when the drug war was really heating up, we had the crack epidemic. You had leaders of both major parties who wanted to bring the active duty troops in to fight the drug war. They wanted Marines conducting drug raids and marching up and down city streets. They wanted the Navy to be intercepting ships, which, another thing that we're seeing now. Um, and it was opposition from the Pentagon itself that thwarted that idea. Now, there were still a lot of lines that were blurred, and the Reagan administration still did a lot of things that kind of, I think, hastened the militarization of police. But it was opposition from Caspar Weinberger and also some high-ranking people at the Pentagon that said, no, like, this is not what free societies do. There was a quote from Andrew Olsted, who was a major general, I believe, at the time in the Marines, who said history is replete with examples of countries that have brought the military in for domestic policing, and disaster is always the result. That was in testimony before Congress. So, what Trump has done is basically sort of obliterated all of this. He has said that as president, he has the authority to call up the military anytime he wants, to deploy them anywhere he wants for any reason that he wants. And he's clearly using it for, to settle scores, for partisan reasons. He's has been deliberately sending them to cities that are run by mayors with whom he has personal beefs, with governors with whom he has personal beefs. I guess the exception would be sending them to Memphis, which he did with the consent of our governor, Bill Lee, but against the wishes of local officials in Memphis. Um, and it's clearly he's doing this for, there is no particular reason why he's doing this. They claim in Los Angeles, they claimed it was because protesters were making it impossible for federal immigration officers to do their jobs. Well, one, what they were doing was, they were doing their jobs in particularly aggressive ways that were violating people's, basic rights, which I'll get to in a moment. But also, the protests weren't violent for the most part. I think there was one incident of a car that was set on fire. But the idea that this was some sort of national emergency that required the National Guard and eventually active duty Marines, which Trump also set in, there just wasn't any evidence for that. They also tried to claim that rising crime was the reason why they had to send in the military and the National Guard. Crime is down in every single city to which Trump has sent the National Guard. There is no emergency in any of these cities. Crime is coming down, as I said, in all of them. In some cases, they're approaching record low levels of violent crime. Los Angeles is almost at a record low. DC was at a 30-year low when the National Guard was sent in. It is solely because Trump wants to flex. He wants to, demonstrate his power. We saw this in Los Angeles when there was widespread criticism of his decision to send in the Marines when the National Guard and the Border Patrol conducted a raid on MacArthur Park, and this is a park in an immigrant-heavy area of the city. There was no one in the park. There were no arrests made. It was basically, as documents that media organizations later got hold of, it was a show of force. They were trying to demonstrate their power. We also saw this, when Trump conducted his military parade. He has long sort of admired dictators and strongmen who put down protests with violence. Um, there was a famous interview with Playboy, I think in the 90s, where he praised the Tiananmen Square massacre as a show of strength. He praised Nicolas Maduro for putting down protests in that country during his first term. He praised Erdogan in Turkey for the way that he handled protests in a particularly violent, aggressive way. He even initially praised President Xi in China for the crackdown in on the democracy protesters in Hong Kong. So there's a history here. And the history is one of a president who admires, dictators and strongmen who suppress dissent and who use kind of the military to show off their strength and their power. Um, let's see. So we saw the other thing, I guess the one other thing, one of the really kind of frustrating things I think about what's happening right now is the courts have been just extremely deferent to the administration, and that's because historically the courts have deferred to the federal government, particularly the executive. In these cases, they've sort of deferred to the executive as I think it's called the doctrine of normality, I think, or something, or regularity, I think it's called. And the idea is that, they're going to assume that the executive is telling the truth in its court filings and its arguments before the courts. They're always going to assume that the executive is arguing in good faith. And what we're finding is that this administration does neither of those things. And so the courts then basically in each of these cases, anytime somebody has sued and said that something that Trump is doing a lot, particularly a lot of the stuff he's doing under emergency orders, um, are based on, misstatements of fact, misleading legal arguments, disingenuous legal arguments. But because of this sort of presumption of regularity, um, you have to, it takes a lot of evidence to convince a court to begin to suspect that the executive isn't on the up and up when they're arguing in court documents and in front of judges. And so it takes a long time. And so what we found is, for example, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in Los Angeles said that they did a review of the Trump administration's claims that they needed to send in the National Guard because immigration officials weren't able to do their jobs. They weren't, the protests were preventing them from doing their jobs. And the court, looked at the evidence presented by the administration and said, okay, well, that argument is legally valid if the executive claims that they can't perform executive functions because of unrest in a city. That is a justification under this federal law to send in the National Guard. And we have no reason to suspect that they are misleading us about what's actually happening in Los Angeles. Well, 4 days after that ruling, Kristi Noem stood up in a press conference and said the reason why the National Guard was in LA was to liberate it from its socialist leadership, referring to the mayor and the governor of California. Now that, I don't think I need to say it, but I will anyway. That is not a legitimate reason to send in the National Guard to liberate a city from its democratically elected leadership. That is what we see in totalitarian countries. And yet, the courts continued to sort of take the administration at face value. I want to move on to kind of a second pillar of free societies that we've seen toppled in recent months, and that's the idea that that free societies don't have secret police. The very notion of secret police is always something we've associated with, Eastern Bloc countries during the Soviet era, during the Cold War era, juntas in, South Asia or Latin America. We just in this country, armed masked law enforcement agents don't jump out of unmarked cars and pluck people off the street and take them to secret black sites where they're interrogated. Like that's something we don't do here. And yet that is what we are seeing now. We've seen I mean the speed with which we've seen ICE and Border Patrol agents don these masks and defenses from this administration. I mean, it's pretty shocking to me, and I'm pretty cynical and jaded after covering these issues for about 20 years. Um, but it is. It's hard to think of a bigger threat to a free society than the idea that you can have police officers who are able to shield their identity while carrying out this kind of force and this kind of violence against the public. They're literally taking people off the streets, kidnapping them. We have video of this, putting them into marked cars. We know that they're deliberately taking people that they detain to detainment facilities that are far away from where they live, far away from their attorneys. I know I've talked to several immigration attorneys who tell me that many times they didn't find out where one of their clients had been detained until they were already on a plane being deported. Um, the administration is also going after people, not just people who are undocumented, but people who were invited to the country under humanitarian laws, under refugee status, protected status. Trump has revoked all of those statuses sort of retroactively, making people who have been here in some cases for 10, 15, 20 years now undocumented, then sweeping them up and moving them into expedited deportation hearings and sometimes deporting them within a matter of days before they even have a chance to mount a defense. Um, but one of the things one of the I don't know what I find to be a clear kind of moment of sanity from the last 25 years compared to what we're doing now. I point to a post, it was a blog post in, I think it was like 2004, 2005, by a guy named Michael Ledeen, who was a neoconservative who, I didn't agree with on much. And at the time, he was advocating for war with Iran, for a regime change in Iran. And he put this on a site called Pajamas Media, which I think might still be around. It was sort of a conservative opinion outlet. And at the time, there was a series of photos from Reuters that came out of a drug raid in Tehran. And the allegation was that these people were dealing cocaine. And so the Iranian police came in and raided this place. And in the photos, all the Iranian police were wearing masks. And Ladine, who again was trying to portray Iran as kind of an evil empire, which, in many ways it is, said, I can't remember exactly his exact wording. I've got it somewhere written down, but he said, he wrote that you can always tell that you always tell a lot about the relationship between a government and its people by whether its law enforcement officers wear masks, whether they shield their identities, right? This was his description of one sure sign that you can tell that a regime was evil was if their police officers hid their identities while they were carrying out their duties. Now, even at the time, I'd been writing a lot about SWAT teams and drug raids, and I knew that in a lot of SWAT raids, officers wore balaclavas and covered their faces. But most of the time, they did have badges and badge numbers, and they gave their names and they left a warrant. What we're seeing right now with ICE is classic secret police type stuff. They're not giving their names. They're not providing their badge numbers. In some cases, they're not wearing badges. They're using unmarked cars that they've rented. There just a report yesterday that they're now taking license plates off of those cars, so you can't even identify them by their plates. Um, and again, there's no accountability. And this I think is one of the scariest developments. And this happened prior to the Trump administration, but they're really going to be able to take advantage of it. And that is that over the last 25 to 30 years, the Supreme Court has basically made it impossible to hold federal law enforcement officers accountable, even for really egregious abuses. So in the early 70s, there was a case called Bivens, I think it's called Bivens versus seven unknown drug enforcement agents. And in this case, the DEA had conducted a raid on somebody's home, and it turned out to be the wrong house, and they, held people at gunpoint. And Congress, after the Civil War, had created, with the passage of the Ku Klux Klan Act, had created a cause of action for people to sue state officials when state officials violated their constitutional rights, right? It's called Section 1983, and this is, when people sue police officers, that's the law that they're using. But that only applied to state police or state officials. There is no companion law that lets you sue federal law enforcement when they violate your constitutional rights. And part of the reason was because at the time that law was the Ku Klux Klan Act was passed, there just wasn't a significant law enforcement presence in the federal government. Um, so in the early 70s, the Supreme Court created a way to sue federal officials when they violate your rights, and this was this Bivens case. And it made sense. I mean, even though Congress hadn't authorized it, as a civil libertarian, I believe in the slogan that there are no rights without remedies, right? If there's no way for you to hold government agents accountable when they violate your rights, do you really have those rights in the first place? And so this provided a way to civilly sue federal law enforcement. Well, over the next 40 years or so, the court had just consistently has chipped away at Bivens. They've made it harder and harder and harder to sue under Bivens to the point where there's a joke in the constitutional law community that basically the only way that you can get into court under Bivens is if you have a client named Bivens, right? If your case differs from it in any other way, the courts are going to throw it out. Well, in 2022, in a case called Egbert versus Boulay, the current U.S. Supreme Court basically just put the final nail in the coffin of Bivens. Now, they didn't have the courage to come out and say that that's what they're doing, but in a concurring opinion, Justice Gorsuch said, this is what we're doing, and we should just go ahead and admit it. So what this means is that no matter how egregiously federal law enforcement agents violate your constitutional rights, you basically have no recourse against them. There's no way to hold them accountable. Currently, the only way they can be held accountable in any real sense is if they're prosecuted under criminal law. But that would require the Justice Department to bring criminal charges against them and prosecute them. And we know that that's not going to happen under this administration. So right now, we have this administration telling these immigration officers, your job is to deport as many people as possible, as quickly as possible. We have a Supreme Court that has said, you can even racially profile people if you want to do it. You have people like Stephen Miller saying, we want you to be raiding community centers and Home Depots and rounding everybody up before you even, know if they're undocumented or not. We just want you to go, harass as many people as possible, cast a wide net. I think they have a goal of deporting 1,000 people a day. Um, and then there's nothing pushing back on the other side. There's nothing that these officers have to worry about for going too far, for using too much force, or for using too much violence. And that I think is a very scary proposition. You also know, ICE has now been given, I think its budget has been, I don't know, increased by four or five, six-fold under the big beautiful bill. Apparently, from what I've read, once ICE is fully staffed, it will be larger than I think all but seven or eight militaries in the world. And these are going to be people who uh, you know, who have seen these videos that we've seen circulated online, who have seen the way that ICE is acting, and are saying to themselves, "That's what I want to do for a living," right? That's what who are excited by those videos. That's who's going to be signing up going forward as ICE staffs out to the personnel levels that are called for under this bill. Um, so we have federal police forces that are unaccountable, that cannot be held accountable legally, that are unlikely to be ever to be prosecuted criminally. In theory, a local prosecutor could try to charge them under state law, but historically, what happens then is the federal government just asks that those charges be moved to federal court and then drops them. And that's happened under previous administrations too. That's not unique to the Trump administration. Um, so I think this is pretty scary. And then we look at the masks. The last kind of way that, in theory, these officers could be held accountable would be through social, shaming, through social sanctions, right? If you have to show your face at church after you were just in a viral video where you were, arresting a 12-year-old kid, maybe that could serve as a deterrent to some of the more abusive behavior we've seen. And the masking and the administration letting them mask when they carry out these operations, basically kind of removes that last method of accountability. Um, I want to just jump to due process. So obviously, due process is something that we consider important in this country. It's the notion of habeas corpus, that we don't hold people indefinitely without letting them see a judge first, and that the government has to justify its reason for detaining somebody. This administration has explicitly argued that people who are here without documentation, people who are here illegally, don't get due process, don't deserve due process. Now, I have a problem with that on a very sort of moral, legal, fundamental level, but also just from a practical standpoint, how do you know someone is here without authorization unless you give them due process to figure out whether or not they're here legally? And this is what we saw with the Trump administration's rounding up of people and sending them to CCOT, the basically slave labor prison in El Salvador. They were telling us that the people they were rounding up were hardcore gang members, members of Tren de Aragua, the Venezuelan gang. And they cited tattoos that people had and claimed that these were all hardened, violent criminals, and that they didn't deserve due process. Well, what did we find? Well, we found that after people I think one press outlet got a manifest of one of the planes that took these people to CCOT. And we found, I think it was that, I think the Cato Institute found that 8 in 10 of them had no prior criminal record of any kind. The administration really didn't even make an effort to show any sort of gang affiliations or gang ties. One of the people that was deported, the tattoo he had that the administration claimed was linked to Tren de Aragua, was an autism awareness tattoo because he had an autistic brother. Another had a tattoo of his favorite soccer team, Real Madrid. Um, the other problem with that whole theory was that apparently Tren de Aragua does not encourage members to identify themselves with tattoos. So everything about the administration's claim was basically bullshit, to be frank. And so we found that, these people, if these people had due process, they wouldn't have been sent to this place. But, even more disturbing was the reaction of the administration. I mean, Pam Bondi said that these people would never, ever get out of this prison, that they were there for the remainder of their lives. Now, we know now that they were lying about that, but they claimed that El Salvador controlled the prison and the administration had no power over this. And that was always transparently ridiculous. But it was proven ridiculous when the administration then cut a deal with El Salvador, releasing all these prisoners, and then they just sort of dumped them all in Venezuela. But that it was a great example of why due process is important. You can say what you want that these are the worst people on earth and they don't deserve due process, but we don't know that they're the worst people on earth until we actually give them due process. And that is the whole point of due process. Um, we're now seeing the Trump administration is arresting people at courthouses as they show up for their immigration hearings. In some cases, they're showing up for green card hearings. One guy was showing up expecting to get his citizenship. And what they're doing is they've expanded this idea of expedited removal, and they claim that it gives them the right to deport these people much more quickly without the kind of due process the immigration system traditionally affords. And so in some cases, these people were here on for humanitarian reasons. The Biden administration had released them on probation while their cases are pending, which means that they are technically here legally. But the Trump administration then declared that all of those people are not here legally, just sort of unilaterally declared that, which then they say gave them permission to arrest them when they showed up for their hearings. Now, there's so much wrong with that, right? You're arresting people while they're trying to comply with the law, while they're trying to do what they're supposed to be doing. You're also retroactively applying this new policy to people. It's basically an ex post facto law, but fortunately, the Constitution's prohibition on ex post facto laws does not apply to immigration. But also, you're discouraging people. You're turning the courthouse from a place of justice, and we can all question how effectively courts deal out justice, but that is what it's supposed to be, and you're turning it into a place of fear. And so what we're seeing is that immigrants, documented and otherwise, are afraid to go to court now. They're afraid to go to court to testify as witnesses, to testify in domestic violence cases or custody hearings. It's created a lot of fear in these communities of courthouses in general, and that's kind of the point. Um, we've seen the other thing the administration has openly admitted to doing is getting people to forego their due process rights by basically making things so miserable for them while they're here that they don't want to fight anymore. So um, the conditions in these detainment facilities, I mean, you're talking, cells that have 20, 25 people in them. People are sleeping on the floor. There's documentation of people going without water for 2 or 3 days, for people being withheld food or being served food that's spoiled. There's all sorts of documentation of really horrid conditions at these facilities. And they've made no secret about the fact that that is the goal. That is what they want to do. They want people to self-deport. They want people to agree to leave and give up their due process rights by holding them in conditions that are so inhospitable that they don't want to stay here any longer. There's a recent case of a woman named Alison Bastillo Chinchilla. She's from Honduras. She was brought here at the age of 5, I believe, and by her parents. Again, she obviously had no say in the matter. She went to high school, graduated with honors, got a scholarship to nursing school, and was in nursing school when ICE raided her home. They were actually looking for someone else, someone who actually had a criminal record, but who hadn't lived there in years. They raided this house. Um, while they were there, they decided to just do an immigration check on the family that was living there, and found that she was undocumented. They held her in a facility in Georgia that's known to be known to have pretty inhumane conditions. She was there for 6 months, and she finally agreed to self-deport back to Honduras, a country she's never known. She hasn't seen since she was 5. Because the conditions were so bad at that facility, they were denying her medication. Her health was deteriorating pretty quickly. And the one thing that she asked was that she be able to self-deport so that, one, she didn't want to return to Honduras in handcuffs, and two, that would give her the ability to reapply for entry, I think in like 5 or 6 years, whereas if you're forcibly deported, um, in some cases you can apply in 10 years. In some cases, you're barred completely from ever reapplying for entry. The government tried A court had to stop them, but they tried to deny her even that. Even though she had agreed to self-deport, they tried to forcibly deport her so that they could shackle her, and then they could deny her from reapplying for reentry. And there are lots of cases like this of people. I mean, the administration has been very upfront about the fact that they want to make things so miserable for people that they'll voluntarily return, to the countries that they were born in, I guess. Um, this was part of the family separation policy too. I mean, what we learned from the first administration is that their goal with the family separation policy was to deter future migrants from coming here by under the threat of we're going to pull your children from you and send them thousands of miles away from you and you'll never see them again. That was a policy that they wanted known in other countries to prevent people from coming here. My next pillar, I guess, is your papers, please. This is, a phrase that we often again associate with former Soviet bloc countries, the idea that you have to prove your legitimacy as a citizen everywhere you go and show your documentation. I think the immigration rates, particularly in cities where ICE is heavy right now, have made that the de facto policy for anyone who isn't white, basically. If you look Latino, if you look like what an ICE agent pictures to be an undocumented immigrant, you should be carrying proof of your citizenship. Otherwise, you risk detainment. Here in Nashville, Tennessee, where I live, ICE and state troopers were pulling over in June anybody who looked Latino or Hispanic, and if they could prove their citizenship, they let them go. If they couldn't, they were arrested, and then they had to prove their citizenship from behind a jail cell. Um, white motorists that they mistakenly pulled over were also let go. And we're seeing this, all over the country, particularly in cities that Trump has targeted because he doesn't like their leadership. What we just seen in Chicago, this just came out last week. There's a law from the 1950s during the Eisenhower administration. Eisenhower, of course, uh, implemented Operation Wetback, the unfortunately named policy of mass deportations that Stephen Miller has cited as his model. Um, but there's a law from that era that says if you're here, if you're a non-citizen who's here legally on a green card or through some humanitarian program, you have to keep documentation of your citizenship on you at all times. Otherwise, you can be fined. And that law has never been enforced because one, it's ridiculous and offensive. And so it hasn't been enforced, but it also hasn't really been challenged. I imagine it would be struck down if it was challenged. But the Trump administration has started enforcing it. So there have been several people in Chicago who are here on green cards who were fined, I think it was a couple $100 because ICE detained them. And even though they were here legally, they did not have proof of their legal residency on them, on their person at the time. It's also if you have a green card or some other documentation that allows you to be here as a non-citizen, carrying it around carries its own risks, right? If you lose your green card, it's difficult and expensive to replace. It's better to keep it somewhere safe if you need it. But this is making people carry it with them at all times, which again, having your paperwork on you at all times is not something we associate with living in a free country. Um, the last kind of pillar I want to talk about, and then we can discuss, I guess, if you'd like, is the idea of collective punishment. So again, this is not something that we think happens in free societies. We don't punish you because you're a member of a group, whether it's an ethnic group or a country of origin group or a religious group, a sexual orientation group that the government believes to be criminal or unworthy of due process or fair treatment by law enforcement. We don't punish you because of whatever groups you happen to be a member of. So what we're seeing in Chicago now, ICE is gassing entire neighborhoods because of protests against ICE. We saw Justice Kavanaugh's concurrence in the Los Angeles lawsuit, where he basically says that gives the okay to racially profile people for immigration violations. And the justification he gives, and I think this is a really revealing argument that he makes, which is that if you are here illegally, you have no right to not be racially profiled, right? Because you're here illegally, you're breaking the law. If you are here illegally, he says, at worst, you can expect to be stopped. You prove your citizenship and you're released. It's a minor sort of inconvenience. Um, One point I've made for a long time is the fact that until Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, that there were no criminal defense attorneys on. Can you hear that dinging? I'm sorry, it's my try to turn that off if I can. The fact that there are no criminal defense attorneys on the court has led to a real myopia with the justices when it comes to how criminal justice policy is really enforced on the ground. There is this kind of Pollyanna-ish way that they evaluate these cases. The example I always give is there was a case involving drug sniffing dogs and whether a dog sniff was a search under the Fourth Amendment. And during the oral arguments, Justice Scalia was interrogating the attorney who was arguing on behalf of somebody who had been charged because of a drug dog sniff. And the guy was pointing out that drug dogs have a really high false positive rate. Sometimes they're worse actually than a coin flip. That's less than 50%. And the reason for this is not because drug dogs aren't able to sniff out illicit substances. It's that we've trained something else in them that's more powerful, and that is the desire to please us. And so what happens in these cases, the drug dog is looking at the handler and reading the handler, and if the handler thinks there's drugs in the car, then the drug dog will alert, at which point the handler will then be able to search. But Scalia wasn't buying this, and he was just saying, why would a narcotics officer possibly want a dog that falsely alerts? Like he couldn't understand why that would be. He's like, it would just be a huge waste of his time. And what he didn't understand is that, of course they do. They want to search everybody they pull over, right? They want, there are asset forfeiture incentives. There are quota, arrest incentives. I mean, and he just couldn't understand that. And I thought about that when I read this Kavanaugh opinion, where he just sort of assumes that, ICE is going to calmly, stop you as if you were, trying to get into a concert, right? And they're going to stop you and say, could you please prove your citizenship, sir? And then you hand them an ID, and then they send you on your way. And as we've seen, that is not what's happening. U.S. citizens have been detained for days, taken to detention centers. U.S. citizens have been harassed, have been thrown to the ground, tackled, handcuffed. I'm currently working on an article about all of this for the New Republic, and one of the people I talked to is a former ICE attorney. He was an attorney during the Obama administration, who is now does immigration defense law, and he told me something I thought was really unfortunate, I guess is a way of putting it. He said that when he was at ICE, they would sometimes detain and arrest American citizens by mistake. I mean, you can't deport, tens of thousands of people every year without occasionally making mistakes. He said, but when they did detain a U.S. citizen or arrest a U.S. citizen by mistake, it was sort of an all hands on deck moment, right? It was like, this is bad. We have to fix this. Let's find out what errors caused this to happen. And I think the last survey I saw said there are about 3 dozen U.S. citizens who were arrested and detained over 10 years by ICE. And what this former ICE attorney told me is that what he's seeing now is it's not that they're encouraged to arrest and detain U.S. citizens. It's that it's just sort of, it happens, and it's just sort of like, well, you know what? That's an incidental problem to this bigger goal of deporting 1,000 people a day. It's a problem we can live with and deal with. And when it's revealed eventually, these people are getting out, but only after they've, endured a hell of a lot of trauma that thankfully we shouldn't be inflicting on non-US citizens either. But in the case if a legal resident is actually deported, and in some cases, they're deporting people to third countries that, somebody from El Salvador is being deported to, Rwanda or Eswatini, or the Sudan, you know, how do they get back, right? There's no recourse once you're on that plane. And that was one thing he found really disturbing, was that there wasn't that sort of sense of alarm within the federal government when they would learn that they had arrested a U.S. citizen. And consequently, he said it's happening a lot more often than it ever has. Um, let's see. I also just think I guess the final point I would just make on this collective punishment idea is, Stephen Miller, one of the things he did that really kind of ramped up the immigration enforcement was, this was about 3 or 4 months ago, and this is widely reported, that he said we aren't deporting nearly enough people. He was angry and he was furious, and he said, we need to start raiding Home Depots. We need to start raiding places where, people typically think that undocumented immigrants converge and hang out. And that is collective punishment, right? I mean, it's not that they are that ICE agents are doing their research and finding someone who is here illegally or who has a removal order or has a criminal record, and they're, finding out where that person lives and sending 5 agents to apprehend that person and detain them. They're going to workspaces, to Home Depot parking lots. They're arresting everybody in sight, and then they're figuring out later who's here legally and who isn't. That is collective punishment, right? I mean, the fact that you're being arrested, you're having cuffs put on you. I mean, if you look at what happened in Chicago on the South Shore a couple of weeks ago, according to the administration, they believe that there was one member of Trende Aragua living in this dilapidated apartment building. And because there was one person in there, they sent Black Hawk helicopters, and you had ICE agents rappelling down onto the roof from helicopters. They raided the entire building. They kicked down doors, deployed flash grenades. Everyone in the building was detained. Their doors were knocked off their hinges. They never bothered repairing them, so people were living in these apartments with no doors, no privacy. U.S. citizen children were taken out of their beds. In some cases, some were naked. They were zip tied. They were put in the backs of U-Haul trucks until they could sort everything out. And they did this. They punished this entire building and subjected people to this, horrific terror and trauma in order to apprehend one alleged member of Tren de Aragua. Miller would later say that the whole building was full of them a couple of days after the raid. But since then, the administration, I guess last week they said there were two, and now they've revised that down to one. So again, it's this idea that we can do whatever we want. We can punish entire groups of people because of the actions of a few. And I would just say, finally, we're seeing this with how the administration is preemptively describing the No Kings protest coming up on Saturday. The previous No Kings protest, from what I read, it was the third largest peaceful protest in U.S. history on a single day. And there was, as far as I know, not a single incidence of violence around the country. There were thousands of protests. The groups that are planning this are emphasizing nonviolence, and yet, Republicans are preemptively describing this as an America-hating protest, which is silly and childish, but also more disturbingly, calling these people who are going to show up on Saturday, these protests, pro-Hamas, pro-Antifa, and, violent extremists. And, I saw the pictures from the last No Kings protest. I'm going to go to the one here in Nashville and take some photos, but these were regular people, right? These were grandmothers. I mean, I'm sure there were extremists and people I don't agree with on very many issues at them, but by the most part, these were regular people. They're just people who happen to oppose this administration, and this administration is deemed basically that opposing it is akin to treason. Frankly, I mean, they've come right out and said that opposing Donald Trump is a form of treason. Um, so I'm worried about where we are. I've been covering these issues for a long time, and I've never seen, it's not just what they're doing, it's that they're not even trying to hide what they're doing. They're very upfront about it. They've decided that, doing it out in the open is the best way to sort of show how serious they are about it, and to nip any possible dissent or objection in the bud before it happens. I ended my Warrior Cop book by talking about the term police state, and this is a line I would give in speeches about the book as well. I'd say, we don't live in a police state. It's an exaggeration to say that, but the thing about a police state is that it's important to speak up before you get there, right? Because once you get there, it's too late to do anything about it. And I think, I fear at this point that we are rapidly approaching that point where it's too late to do anything.
That's one awesome presentation, Radley. Thank you very much. Richard, are you there? We seem to have lost Richard. Uh, so, Radley, we hear a lot about the Insurrection Act that the administration is raising. Can you explain what that's all about and why that seems to be so important to them?
Yeah, so Trump wanted to invoke the Insurrection Act during his first term to put down the George Floyd protests, but to bring in the military. So the U.S. has this law from the post-Civil War days called the Posse Comitatus Act, and it's widely kind of misunderstood, but it basically, the way it's come to be interpreted, even though this wasn't the reason it was passed, but the way it's come to be interpreted is that the military can't be used for domestic law enforcement unless the president declares invokes the Insurrection Act. So the Insurrection Act is sort of the law that lets the president get around the Posse Comitatus Act. But what he has to do is he has to first declare an insurrection, and an insurrection is basically what it sounds like. It has to be a direct threat to the rule of law, to the ability of kind of the government and society to function. He then has to issue a dispersal order to the place that's experiencing the insurrection, and then he can send in the military. But it's also supposed to be temporary. If I remember right, at some point, I think Congress is supposed to has to sort of weigh in and approve it. And so what, I think when Trump tried to invoke it in his first term, he was basically told by Mike Esper, his Secretary of Defense, and by Milley, his Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, that they would resign if he did it, because they thought it was inappropriate, that there was no evidence that the George Floyd protest had approached, an insurrection that merited this kind of response. And apparently Trump never really got over that. This is one of the main reasons why he has said that Milley and Esper are guilty of treason, and has said that or Milley in particular, I think he said should be executed. Um, so, but I think they now want to try it. They want to see if the courts are going to let them get away with it. And I think a lot of what's happening right now is them testing boundaries and testing their limits and seeing what they'll be able to get away with. The National Guard, to be honest, based on my own experience reporting on this stuff, I actually think the National Guard would be better than what we've seen from ICE and Border Patrol. National Guard troops tend to be from the communities where they're deployed. Although Trump is trying to get around that too by sending, Texas National Guard troops into Illinois. But, and when Trump cleared out Lafayette Park to do his Bible photo op, it was National Guard troops who later said, called the administration out and said, no, these protests were not violent. This response is wholly disproportional. That came from National Guard troops who had been sent there to support the effort, and they did not like what they saw. National Guard troops are part-time. They're your dentist, your mailman, your car mechanic. They're people who live in their communities, and they haven't been kind of exposed to, I think, the toxic police culture that we see in ICE and Border Patrol. That said, his desire to send the National Guard and to invoke the Insurrection Act shows a complete kind of I wouldn't even say ignorance so much as contempt for kind of the constitutional principles and guidelines and norms that have been in place, for 249 years in this country. So yeah, he can invoke it if he wants. It's a dramatic thing. I think the last time it was invoked was in 1992 during the LA riots. And that was with the consent of the governor of California. Trump wants to invoke it over the objections of the governors where he wants to send troops. And again, there's nothing justifying this, right? There's no insurrection, like there's no rioting. There are protests in these places, but it's no worse than a typical, weekend in any of these cities. We are not seeing people aren't taking over government buildings. They're not, burning things down. They're not assassinating, political leaders. I mean, it is, he's doing it because he wants to, and he wants to see if he can. And I worry that the main reason they're doing this is that they want to do it. They want to send troops in ahead of the midterms because they want to intimidate people, from voting.
Okay, on that note, we'll wrap things up. Again, Radley Balko, fantastic series blog that he posts at the Watch on Substack. Highly advise you to subscribe to it, support it financially. He's just announced a new podcast that he has with The Intercept, which I've heard the first two segments, or at least part of them, and they're fantastic. So, Radley, thank you again.
My
Fantastic
pleasure.
presentation.
Thanks for everything you do, Jacob. Appreciate it.
Thank you. And next week we got John Whitehead, head of the Rutherford Institute, another fantastic defender of civil liberties. I know you'll enjoy his presentation. Radley, until next time, thank you so much.
Thanks, Jacob.